Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and not too long ago in 2018, when Amazon had its Prime Day sale, my wife saw that they had the entire collection of Harry Potter movies for $22. And so she bought the entire set, and we recently finished watching those. And I noticed, not necessarily for the first time, but more so than before, several parallels with the Lord of the Rings stories. And so I wanted to talk about some of those in this video. Now, as a disclaimer, I should note that I've not read the Harry Potter novels in a long time, but I'm pretty sure most of the things that I'm going to point out here are accurate from the standpoint of movies representing the books, so I think that they're pretty much all accurate. And I am, of course, working from my knowledge of the books for the Lord of the Rings. So with that disclaimer noted that some of the stuff may be a little bit different in the Harry Potter novels, let's go ahead and take a look at some things. Starting with the really obvious, let's look at the great enemies in both series. We have, of course, Sauron in The Lord of the Rings and Voldemort in Harry Potter. Both are referred to as the Dark Lord. Rather specific, which, that's not necessarily terribly specific. Dark Lord, kind of makes sense, but you don't really see that a lot prior to Tolkien's fiction, so it's hard to imagine that the two not being connected. And by the way, I should note, I don't necessarily know what J.K. Rowling's exposure to Lord of the Rings was. She's interested in fantasy, obviously, so it wouldn't surprise me if she read or saw the earlier versions of the movies or something like that, but I'm not claiming that any of this is like directly lifted from the Lord of the Rings, but there are some weird parallels. Anyway, Voldemort is called the Dark Lord just as Sauron is, or Morgoth if you go to the first age. They're both called the Dark Lord. Also, weirdly enough, they both are capable of commanding the wills of others. Sauron, you very much get the idea, has semi-direct, if not direct, control over what the actions of his servants are, because in the Black Gate battle at the very end, we get a mention that when his attention is redirected to Mount Doom, where Frodo is dangerously close to throwing the ring into the fire, when his attention is diverted, it says that all of his captains and whatnot were suddenly steerless. It's like the will that kind of led them to do what they were doing no longer paid them any attention, and so they're just like, wait, what are we doing? In, of course, Harry Potter, that's done through the Imperius Curse, one of the three unforgivable curses, which we're told by Mad-Eye Moody, actually not Mad-Eye Moody, but we think it's Mad-Eye Moody at the time. It's actually Barty Crouch Jr. Pretending to be Mad-Eye Moody. He says that a lot of people who were, following Voldemort claim that they only did so under the influence of the Imperius Curse. So we have two Dark Lords who literally control the wills of other people. That's not a huge parallel, but it's one of the more obvious ones. Now let's look at kind of the flip side of that. On the other side of the coin, we have Gandalf and Dumbledore. Gandalf, of course, being the one wizard who stuck to his job in Middle-earth, and Dumbledore being the greatest wizard other than Voldemort in the world of Harry Potter at the time. Now, there's a couple of different similarities between these two wizards. Gandalf and Dumbledore have at least similar appearances. Dumbledore doesn't wear the giant blue pointy hat and all that, but he does have, the big long beard, and he dresses in, certainly not normal muggle clothes that you might call them in the world of Harry Potter. And so he at least resembles Gandalf. And I can't help but notice also that after Richard Harris died and they had to replace him with Michael Gambon in the later Harry Potter movies, he also looks more like Dumbledore, and more like Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings movies in terms of facial features. Ian McKellen and Gambon look oddly similar in ways that Richard Harris and Ian McKellen did not, at least as they're made up in their characters. Obviously, Ian McKellen doesn't look quite like Gandalf when he's not wearing the prosthetics and all that, but that's just kind of a funny coincidence. I don't know that they were shooting for that or what, but anyway. The other thing, even more than their appearance, is kind of their personality. Gandalf can be a very kindly person, especially to the hobbits, but he also doesn't stand for any foolishness. He's perfectly willing to point out when Pippin is an idiot. Uh, Even when other people are, somewhat trying his patience, he can, or even Frodo himself. I mean, there's occasions where Frodo will say something and Gandalf's like, haven't you been listening? Dumbledore is kind of similar. He comes off as a very grandfatherly, kindly figure, but whenever somebody's kind of not really paying attention or something, he's perfectly capable as well of stepping in and saying, pay attention, get with the program here. So their personalities as well as their appearances are somewhat similar, and of course they're both in the position of being, at least at the end of the Lord of the Rings, Gandalf is a more powerful wizard than Saruman, and Dumbledore is arguably the most powerful wizard in the world of Harry Potter. Another odd coincidence, it's not a direct parallel, both wizards die, and Gandalf comes back. He actually resurrects basically, whereas Dumbledore doesn't resurrect, but he still manages to help Harry Potter beyond the grave. So, they both die and they both end up helping the defeat of the Dark Lord in their respective stories after dying. So that's another interesting parallel. So that's, the Dark Lord and their major counterpart on the light side. Now let's look at some other stuff. Now let's take a look at protagonists and the people that surround them. Obviously, the Fellowship of the Ring is 9 people, and you get Harry, Ron, and Hermione as the core group we get through Harry Potter. But you do get some interesting similarities. I mean, even in the Lord of the Rings, of course, it gets whittled down to Sam and Frodo at the very end just by themselves. Sam and Frodo and Ron and Harry are kind of an interesting duo. Um, they're the best friends, Harry and Ron, out of the 3. Ron ends up marrying Hermione at the end, but that kind of develops later on in the story. And obviously, you can't have anybody getting married in the Fellowship because they're all men. And in Tolkien's story, that's not going to happen. Whatever your views on that are, that's not happening in Tolkien's world. But anyway, the Harry and Ron relationship is not the same as Frodo and Sam's, but there are some interesting connections between the two. So let me just look at Harry and Frodo just individually at the moment. Interestingly enough, both of these being the protagonists, we don't really ever see them taking a hugely active role in terms of developing the story. I mean, Frodo does things that are active and Harry does things that are active, but by and large, their greatest successes come through either luck, fate, or the aid of their friends. I mean, that you can't really deny that. Frodo, he's doing what he's supposed to do, and Harry is kind of, for the most part, doing what he's supposed to do, but both of them would have ended up dead long before the end had it not been for other people helping them out. The other thing, too, about their respective roles is very, at the end, Frodo almost dies, Harry does die, and then he resurrects. Kind of like, Gandalf there, but anyway. So you get, Frodo kind of succumbs to the ring, and then he comes this close to really blowing the entire thing, whereas Harry, he has to kind of die in order to win. It's kind of, and that's not a direct parallel, but it's kind of weirdly similar. Ron and Sam, on the other hand, they're not super parallel, but I mean, Sam is not the brightest. Ron is not the brightest. Now, Sam is definitely less educated than Ron is, but you also have to remember in the time setting that we're talking about for Lord of the Rings, Sam is very much the kind of person who in that period would have received no education at all. The only indication of his education that we get is when his father, the gaffer, is talking to some people at one of the pubs. He mentions that Bilbo taught him his letters, meaning no harm. You get the idea that he thinks that learning to read and write is actually not necessarily a good thing. And so it's a rather weird throwback to this idea that, it's kind of, what's the point of learning your letters? You're a gardener. You're not ever going to need that. And you get the idea that he thinks that it's going to make him uppity and try to be beyond his station. But at any rate, he's not stupid, but he's certainly not well educated and he's not the smartest person in the group. Ron is kind of similar. He's not stupid. In some ways, he's stupider than Sam, and in some ways, Sam is, stupider than he is. They're not the same, but both of them are definitely the least intellectual of their entire group that they circulate in. So, and they're also, like I mentioned, best friends with the protagonists. Sam is the closest to Frodo. Ron is the closest to Harry. So it's interesting how that kind of plays out. Now let's move a little bit beyond protagonists and look at Dementors and Black Riders. Here again, the parallels are not exact, but they certainly are very strong. The Nazgul, of course, are all dressed in black. You can't see them because they're invisible, and they cause fear wherever they go, and they can even make you pass out from that fear. Basically, Aragorn refers to this as the black breath. It's not just through fear, but they can actually make you, I hesitate to call it ill, but there's no better way to put it. It's almost like being cursed. Eowyn and Faramir and Merry at the end of the Battle of the Pelennor Fields are all suffering from the Black Breath, and Aragorn kind of rescues them all from that problem. But Dementors are very similar. They don't necessarily just cause fear, they kind of just suck all the happiness out of life and make you feel all kinds of negative emotions because they bring to the surface your worst memories and make you focus on that. They're also, of course, black, and it's not exactly clear what they are, but you don't get the idea that they're corporeal in a normal sense. They seem a little bit more like spirits than physical things. They may be physical things, but they're kind of a weird category. So you get the blackness, you get the semi-invisibility. Dementors look kind of like disembodied, almost. You can see a face there, whereas you can't with the Nazgul, but it's very vague. It's never very, you're not looking at somebody and going, yep, that's definitely a clear outline of a face. It's never quite that obvious. So you've got, the being in the black robes and the negative emotion and all this other stuff. Hard not to see the parallel there. So now let's move on to yet another different parallel. Now on this one, I'm going to be reaching just a little bit, and this certainly highlights the idea that Rowling is not necessarily drawing directly from Lord of the Rings, consciously or subconsciously. But Snape and Saruman have a weird parallel. Snape, like Saruman, is a great wizard who ends up joining kind of the bad side. Saruman never completely really joins Sauron because he's actually working for himself, but he certainly is not a good guy. Snape, on the other hand, is pretending, well, at first he actually does become a Death Eater and is working with Voldemort, but he ends up not being on Voldemort's side. He ends up being a double agent for the good guys. So the big difference here is that Saruman and Snape, while they're both fighting against the Dark Lord, Saruman is not fighting for the good guys, whereas Snape is. Another interesting parallel is that they both die. Now, the deaths are also not completely parallel. Saruman dies eventually at the hand of Wormtongue, whereas Snape is killed by Voldemort because he's trying to make sure that he has the right to control the Elder Wand. But it's interesting that both of these are kind of turncoats against the Dark Lord. Both of them end up dying. The main obvious difference between the two, I suppose, is that Snape is always dressed in black, whereas Saruman is always dressed in white. But, that doesn't really seem terribly relevant. Not the strongest parallel, but certainly an interesting one, given the fact that they're both wizards and they both play similar roles in the stories. Now let's go and look at what I think is probably the strongest parallel in the entire series. Now with this final parallel, if the two stories had come out in reverse chronological order, if Rowling had written before Tolkien, I would be wondering if Tolkien had stolen this idea from Rowling. And I'm specifically talking about the idea of Horcruxes, and specifically Slytherin's locket, and the One Ring. Because the One Ring acts very much like a Horcrux, and specifically acts very much like Slytherin's locket. Interestingly, both are worn on a chain around the neck of the protagonist, although what kind of breaks that parallel is that Harry and Ron and Hermione kind of switch off who's wearing the locket during the Deathly Hallows until they finally destroy it. but they're both, they're both worn on a chain around the neck, which is kind of weird. They're both evil in and of themselves. They're both hard to destroy. In both cases, you have to do something very unique in order to actually destroy them. They both seem to have a mind of their own. The ring, of course, can kind of change its size, weight, to make it slip from the finger or something like that. Whereas with Slytherin's locket, we see it trying to strangle Harry when he's trying to recover the sword of Gryffindor from the bottom of a pool. So each of them does kind of their own thing as they want to. Another interesting point, of course, is that both are very powerful. And what really kind of clinches it is the fact that both of them kind of serve as repositories of some of the life force of their creator. Sauron can't be destroyed without destroying the ring because part of his power is in the ring. Voldemort can't be killed without destroying the Horcrux because a piece of his soul is in the Horcrux. So, like I said, if these stories had been written in reverse, then you would really think that Tolkien was kind of stealing from Rowling here. The way it is now, Rowling might have been kind of using ideas about the ring as foundation for her Horcrux, but it's not as obvious because the Horcrux is a little bit more, I don't know, just weirdly specific. Whereas the ring it's always intentionally left semi-vague exactly the way in which it's done, but it's interesting to see all these different parallels. I mean, they're just all over the place. I mean, you can't even see what happens with the Slytherin locket without thinking, my gosh, that's the One Ring. I mean, it just screams at you the entire time. In fact, when I was watching the Deathly Hallows and watching the scene where it's trying to strangle Frodo, that's kind of what gave me the idea for this video, because I was watching that and thinking, oh my gosh, it's the One Ring. So that's, to me, that is probably the single strongest parallel between the two stories. And I have a hard time thinking that they're totally, that Rowling totally came up with that independently. Maybe she did, but it seems weird that she would come up with such a similar idea and not have had any, at least subconscious, influence by the Lord of the Rings. So there's probably other parallels that you could draw between the two stories, but those are the ones that really stood out to me this last time watching through all the movies. So I'll just go ahead and leave it there. So there's my video on parallels between Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. Some of them, you could quibble with, but some of them, especially the Horcrux one, I think that's pretty strong parallel. So anyway, if you did enjoy the video, please give it a thumbs up. Please share it around. If you want to learn more about Tolkien, the worlds he created, or even just about the man himself, please do subscribe to the channel, and you can also follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. Till next time, I am the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.